Thank you all for your patience. It's that time of the afternoon when we'd all like to go curl up in the sun and rest with a full belly. I actually, the title of my presentation is To Relearn the Sense of the World, which is taken from Massao's essay, Ivory Tower and Escrow, I Uno et Plures. And as I listened to all the wonderful memories of Massao and his work and his person and his influence, I thought, when did I first meet Massao? It wasn't in my consciousness till I sat here today and remembered that in the fall of 1979, I was summoned to Massao's office by the secretary of the English department, an older graduate student who dropped out of graduate school for 5 years. I had returned and got this phone call, and I thought, what in heaven's name is going on? Who is this man, and why is he calling me to his office? That was my introduction to Massao, and although I am going to talk about Massao's work and not much about Massao's person, that's not to say that I didn't admire, respect, get into arguments with, and love him very dearly. And I learned many things from him, but one thing that I'd like to say to us today is that I learned from Massao how to protect my students. Massao was the ferocious defender of somebody that many people thought shouldn't have been in the university at all, or finish. And as I heard other people talking about how Massao was as their teacher, I was humbled by realizing that wasn't my experience with him. He never marked up my papers. Actually, we argued all the time. Anyways, so Massao, wherever you are, out there in the Pacific Ocean, or wherever, I think you would at least be a little bit happy that here we all are, not memorializing you, but celebrating your person and your work. Okay, to relearn the sense of the world. A call to arms, that's my subtitle. We'll talk about the arms in a minute. Masao Miyoshi concludes his essay, Ivory Tower and Escrow, Ex Uno Plures, with the poignant observation from which I draw the first part of my title. And I quote from that essay, to right the situation, to null the transaction, and be just to all on earth. We may have to relearn the sense of the world, the totality, that includes all peoples in every race, class, and gender. To relearn the sense of the world. Though Massao qualified it with a conditional, we may have to, I would like to suggest his conclusion as a call to arms for the future of the humanities. No, actually, for the future, period. By that I mean not arms of the military type. Rather, in the first instance, I refer to those which are literally the extremities of our upper bodies, as when we link arms with others, friends and comrades and strangers, and not that only in the university. But I also refer to those metaphorical arms, I am in literature after all, by which we might link to the non-human, the environment, in concert with the human. The arms we might link to try and follow Massao's suggestion to relearn the sense of the world, the many, many linked arms necessary to do that. So then to relearn the sense of the world as a call to arms, ex uno pluribus, as I suspect Massao meant, a counter to e pluribus unum. In rereading the Essays and Trespasses, I was struck again both by Eric's kind, insightful affection for Massao and his work, and by what I understand is that is characteristic of Massao's thought, voraciously wide reading, sometimes startling, but also pointed and insightful questions, a persistent movement between the more local institutions of higher education and their workings, for example, and the larger global forces and powers that frame and push at that local. A stunning weave of footnotes that bears careful witness to his intellectual reach, his sometimes unsettling observations and conclusions, and actually what I imagine is a kind of delight in startling us all. But there was something else is something else still, as I reread those essays, a deep and abiding commitment to the effort to figure things out, to unsettle, to move things forward by unsettling, sometimes, I think, by sheer intellectual will, and a relentless critique of all that is. No cheap shots, no cheap answers. That's the Masao whom I remember and whose person and work we all honor in our own ways today. I hope I honor Masao every day in the university and outside of it in the ferocious and unapologetic questioning that I learned from him over a quarter century ago. But the Masao I knew at least, would have scoffed at everything I've just said. Affectionately. And crumphed and whatever. So I'll move to a few observations inspired by rereading his work, and particularly inspired by Ivory Tower in Escrow ex Uno Pluris. A few observations, and actually to 4 illustrative moments of the kinds of things that I think Masao reminds us we would need to keep in mind in order to relearn the sense of the world as a call to arms. For how might we, in fact, do that, relearn the sense of the world? Certainly from more than one direction, and attending to not only what we see and hear and understand, we are intellectuals, I know, but also what we don't see or hear and can't understand, and sometimes can't know. That's why we need many arms. And if that sounds like a humanities-based observation, my first story is not from the humanities. Recently, and these 4 short points are the kinds of things we would keep in mind simultaneously to begin to follow Masao's suggestion. Recently, 3 complex systems analysts working at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich released the initial results of their analysis of some 43,000 transnational corporations. Drawing from a 2007 database and using mathematical formulae that model natural systems, they moved from their initial analysis of those 43,000 transnational corporations to a much smaller group of the top 1,318, and I am reading because I wouldn't remember these numbers, but I don't want to make a mistake, transnational corporations with interlocking ownerships. Their research is forthcoming in the Public Library of Science 1. The October issue of a periodical called New Scientist published an article in advance of the release of their research, and I quote from that magazine. Each of the 1,318 transnational corporations had ties to 2 or more other companies, and on average, they were connected not to 2, but 20. Although they represented 20% of the global operating revenues, the 1,318 appeared to collectively own through their shares the majority of the world's large blue chip and manufacturing firms, the real economy, representing a further 60% of global revenues. When the team further untangled the web of ownership, and again, I'm quoting from the New Scientist article, it found much of it tracked back to a super entity of 147 transnational corporations, even more tightly knit. All of their ownership was held by other members of the super entity that controlled 40% of the total wealth in the network. In effect, says Glatfelder, one of the researchers, less than 1% of the companies were able to control 40% of the entire network. Most of those 147 were financial institutions. The top 20 included Barclays Bank, JP Morgan, Chase & Company, and the Goldman Sachs Group. That's the end of the quotation. Not surprising news, on the one hand. What some of us suspected all along, maybe. What those occupying Wall Street in New York City know, and now in cities across the country and the world know, but they know it differently. It is the kind of analysis that serves as a pointed reminder in its very statistical, analytical, mathematical formulation of those large global forces which Masao's work repeatedly cites, mapping the ownership and obscenely disproportionate power over the global economy of a small group of financial companies does not change that economy, nor does it alter the position of the humanities in higher education or of higher education itself in many, but I hasten to point out, not all parts of the world. And yet it does offer a specific, focused point of critical leverage in relearning the sense of the world. And to those who would say to the Occupy Wall Street movement that they're dealing in hyperbole, the Zurich group provides a nice material analysis. It also provides a cautionary note to us as intellectuals to not only see the 1,001 fragments around us, but the large forces that frame those fragments. A second point on the less global level of institutions of higher education, here specifically, but again, scarcely exclusively in the United States, Masao Miyoshi's work was ahead of its time in its indictment of the complicitous role of higher education in the excise of global corporate power. From the colonialism, as he points out in that essay, that extracted ivory in the first place, to more recent extractions of transnational corporate profit in multiple forms. The last 10 years have seen such extraction, the last 10 years since his essay, grow ever more ferociously egregious. Ivory Tower and escrow is, among other things, a succinct critical history of that complicity. So Masao would not be surprised by my second story. That is the effort to save the humanities by taking out, to use Masao's metaphor of an escrow, second and third mortgages before that escrow is even complete. In 2010, the president of a leading US research institution advanced in his State of the University address a vision of the importance of the humanities and his effort as the president of one of the leading research institutions in the United States to advance humanities. He received much acclaim for that speech. He illustrated in the speech his sense of the importance of the humanities beyond the university. And then I quote from his speech. I'm not going to say his name. It's easy enough. When I hear military leaders talking about winning the so-called hearts and minds of people in other countries, I'm sorry, that's my parent. I'm interrupting a quote. That's an academic sin. When I hear military leaders talking about winning the so-called hearts and minds of people in other countries, the way I translate that all is based on humanistic and social science disciplines. That requires that we understand the language, the culture, the religion, and the values of those societies, and that is the humanities. We are, end of quote, we are saved. To say this is not to deny a crisis in the humanities, while what the president of that leading research institution said is a statement of fact. On the one hand, the role of academic anthropologists in the US wars, I was happy to hear that the call to call the wars, not the Vietnam War, but the US war in Vietnam. The US wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan is a sad illustration. This is the vision of the importance of, this is a vision of the importance of the humanities, however, in the end of 2010, surely says much about our impoverished present. If it says as much about the future of the humanities, however, then maybe we deserve our demise. Maybe we must demand something else. I put crisis in the humanities in double quotes, but it's not because it has no material reality, as we all know only too well. It is an economic crisis of devastating proportions for institutions of higher education. It has wrought terrible consequences for many of our colleagues, for all of our students. It has highlighted the very escrow in which universities have placed themselves and been placed. I would insist on that double placement in which universities have placed themselves and been placed.